Hey fearsome friends. The audacity of certain people never ceases to amaze me. No one is safe, it seems. Here are 13 true scary kidnapping horror stories to make you that little bit more uneasy with the world. So sit back, relax, get cozy, comfy, warm, because it's time to let your nightmares in. My mom and her best friend spent the day at the beach in Florida. The friend that drove had to go to work, but they stayed and said they would walk home. As they were walking back, it was burning hot in the high 90s when a white pickup truck drove past them. It slowed down, made a U-turn, then pulled up to talk to them. I should preface this with the fact that my mom and her friend were both drop-dead gorgeous and wearing bikinis and shorts. They said the truck that had stopped was being driven by a young man that was very handsome and probably in his late 20s. He offered them a ride, and my mum, who was always wary of strange men even back then, said no, but her friend started to whine and said, "Come on, it's hot and we have another mile to go. It will just take a few minutes." My mum still didn't want to, but her friend climbed in the truck, and my mum didn't want to leave her alone. So she reluctantly climbed in the front seat with her friend, in between her and the man. Her friend was a chatty Cathy, and she talked away to this guy without paying attention to anything around her. But my mum had a bad feeling, and noticed the man still hadn't turned his truck around and was heading out to the dunes, where there was nothing but deserted beaches for miles. Then she looked over, and was shocked to realize then that he had pulled out his junk and was masturbating. My mum instantly became angry, grabbed the door handle and opened the door as she said, "You need to stop this truck right now and let us out." And at the same time, her friend snapped out of it and saw what was going on. She flipped out, and according to my mother, dove straight over her and out of the moving truck. As she jumped out, the man tried to grab her and only got a hold of her bikini top, so it came off. She said she watched as her friend hit the ground, and it was like slow motion. The man then began to speed up, and my mum was looking at how fast the ground was moving when he said, "You can stay here with me or you can jump out. You're gonna die either way." That was enough for my mum. She jumped out and skidded across the road. Her entire left side was road rash from head to toe. And as she laid on the ground dazed and wondering if she was going to die, her now topless friend ran over to her screaming, "Get up, he's coming back." My mum rolled over and looked in time to see him doing a U-turn and speeding back to finish what he'd started. Her friend helped her back up, and they ran towards the beach where they just so happened to jump out, right where a lifeguard station was. They were greeted by lifeguards, many of them their friends who administered first aid, and my mum went through months of healing and had a sprained ankle. Her friend was unharmed, and the man was never caught. At the time of this incident, I was 21 years old in 2003, and I felt like I knew everything. I made poor choices and feel like I've learned a lot from this experience. I lived in New Jersey at the time, and I wanted to move to New York. My friend and I decided that we would find an apartment and room together if we could find it for the right price. So I went on the search for a place and found a basement apartment that was being rented out by a husband and wife. Sounds great, I thought, and the price was great too. It was a couple as well, so no potential for any danger, right? Wrong. I set up an appointment with the husband to come by and check out the place, where he reassured me that his wife would be home so that we could meet her too. It was all set. It was scheduled for about a week, and I figured it would be good for my friend and I to go down there together. However, the day came, and my friend stated that she couldn't get out of work, but begged me to go so that we didn't miss out on the opportunity if it was nice. I took the bus from where I lived in New Jersey to Long Island, New York, and when I got there, the man met me at the bus station. I thought that was strange, but was grateful for the lift. He said he figured he would make sure I'd made it safely there and didn't get lost, which I also thought was very weird, because the bus stop was only about a block from his house. I wasn't listening to the alarm bells in my head at that point until we went inside the house. I was fully expecting the wife to be there, but he then said that his wife had to suddenly go to work, so it would just be him showing me the place. Again, I reluctantly continued on. I looked around everywhere, including the basement, and it all looked great. It was a really nice place, and he started being less creepy, which helped me to relax a bit more. A big mistake on my part, I know. He asked if I smoked weed, and at the time I did, so he asked if I wanted to light up with him. Again, I know, another bad choice. I said yes, and after the second hit, I felt really off. Now, I have smoked some serious weed in my time, but this was not like anything I had ever experienced. I knew it was time to go, and fast, so I said to the man that I had to leave, but he kept trying to get me to rest and relax. I kept saying no, and started walking out of the basement and the house, and he was following behind me slowly. He wasn't chasing me, and hadn't grabbed me or anything. He just kept following, and telling me to come back to his place in a calm and creepy voice. I was so lucky that I made it to the bus stop, right as the bus had pulled up, and I looked at the bus driver and said, "This man just roofied me and is trying to get me back to his place." The bus driver asked me where I was going, and I told him. Then I sat down on the bus and I blacked out. I didn't wake up again until I got to my town in New Jersey. Again, I know I made stupid choices when I was younger, and I have no idea what his intentions were. But to the man with bad intentions, I hope you have been caught. When I was 5, my family attended a church that was 2 stories high. Downstairs were the nursery and Sunday school rooms, and upstairs was the main church room where the service was held, as well as some offices, a kitchen and a library. The main doors opened onto a stairway connecting the 2 levels, and after Sunday school, kids would either continue playing downstairs until their parents came to get them, or if they were old enough and impatient to get home, like me, we could go find our parents upstairs and try to convince them to stop talking and leave. My mum would spend what felt like hours talking to people after the service, so sometimes I'd go up and down the stairs a couple of times, up to ask if we could leave, and back down to play when she said not yet, then repeat it again maybe 10 minutes later. One Sunday during one of my trips up the stairs, there was an elderly couple standing outside the glass doors, smiling and waving at me. I remember thinking that maybe they'd been locked out somehow and wanted to come in, which was a silly thing to think, since the doors were never locked during the hours the church was open. But wanting to be helpful, I went and opened the door and told them they could come in. It turns out that they didn't want to come in, and instead told me they were my grandparents there to pick me up. That confused me, as I was familiar with both sets of my grandparents, and these people were not either. I told them that no, they weren't my grandparents. At that point I was thinking they just had me confused for another kid, and said so. They then quickly stated they were my grandparents and we hadn't met since I was a baby, so I wouldn't remember them, and my parents had asked them to drive me home since they were busy. Even if I hadn't been smart enough to realize they couldn't have just come in if they wanted, that it at least seemed odd to me, and even as they protested that it wasn't necessary, I said I was going to ask my parents and headed up the stairs. My mum was still talking to a group of other churchgoers, but after literally tugging on her sleeve for probably a minute, I was able to get her attention and announce loudly, and at that point probably impatiently, that my great-grandparents were there to pick me up, and I was supposed to go with them. She looked confused, then concerned, and told me my great-grandparents were not there to pick me up, since they were all dead, which pretty quickly put a stop to the discussion about raising money for a stained glass window or whatever. My mum and some other adults went with me back to the door, but the couple was no longer there. Since I couldn't really describe them any better than old, white hair, looked friendly but not my grandparents, it was just sort of uneasily put down to them mistaking me for someone else. From then on, despite my impatience to leave, I stayed downstairs until my parents came and got me. I remember being concerned about it for a while, but my mum would discourage discussing it, saying they had just made a mistake. It is possible that's all it was, but I've always remembered that it felt wrong, how insistent they were that they were there to pick me up. I'm a 21-year-old female, and my birthday is coming up in a couple of weeks. Now, an experience that happened during my birthday vacation a few years ago always comes to mind around this time. My friends and I still don't know if there was actually any ill intent behind this encounter, so I thought I'd finally post it on Reddit and see if anyone else has any thoughts. Now, I was originally not supposed to go on this vacation, but my cousin and best friend, we'll call them T and J, had plans to go to Las Vegas for a concert, and it happened to be the weekend of my 19th birthday. After a bad breakup a month prior, they felt bad for being gone. So T's mom, my aunt, and my parents ended up buying me a plane ticket last minute so I could go as well. So us three girls arrived in Vegas, and the first day and night was a blast. We were staying at a hotel on the Strip with a nice pool, and the next day we decided to spend the day at the pool. We got there and set up our towels and whatnot on the pool chairs. Then I asked T and J to take some pics of me for my Instagram. So J started taking pics, and T was by her watching me, making me laugh and telling me how to sexily pose. But as J was taking the pictures, I looked behind them both to see a man with his phone pointed in our direction, like he was taking pictures of us and watching us. Bear in mind also that there was no one else around us, and we weren't directly in front of him, so he had to turn his body in order for the phone to be pointed in our direction. I'm a shy, timid girl, so I made sure there was no one around, so I could pose and not be so anxious. And in the pics of me, you can see that there's no one around us. I pointed this out to T and J, and they turned around immediately to look. Now all three of us were staring at him, and I was pointing at him, so it was obvious to him he'd been spotted. He didn't immediately put the phone away, but instead turned to a woman that was sitting next to him that I hadn't noticed before, and began chatting with her while his phone was still facing us. They both glanced over at us a couple of times, and this was all weird, but now we were definitely on alert. Mostly we'd just brushed it off, moved on and stopped taking pictures. Then T went and sat in the pool, while J and I lay out to tan. Not long after that, literally probably 5 minutes later, J and I noticed that the woman from earlier had joined T in the pool and was talking to her. T glanced at J and I, so we made our way over to them to make sure everything was okay. J and T continued to talk with the woman, but I was shy and paranoid, so was scoping the area, and that's when I noticed the guy still had his phone out and was now facing us in the pool and watching us. I brought J aside and pointed it out to her, and that's when the woman then got up and went back to the man. T told us that the lady was asking her where we were from and what school we went to, etc. Now we were young, naive girls, so T had told the woman where J and I go to college, because our colleges are only 40 minutes away from each other. The whole thing was making us uneasy, and now we were worried about them knowing where we're from and knowing we were tourists. So Jay and I told T that she could call her mum and tell her about the situation and see what she says about it. As T was on the phone, Jay and I were watching the couple and noticed they were watching T. So Jay and I walked over to T whilst keeping an eye on the couple so they would know we were suspicious. When T finished the phone call, we noticed the couple get up and leave. I don't know what they were doing, and they could have just been trying to be nice, but we were 3 visibly young girls. This couple was in their late 20s, early 30s, and my gut was telling me something was weird. I still wonder to this day, and it creeps me out not knowing, if there was actually pictures of us on that man's phone. I grew up in a safe, beautiful part of my town. All of my neighbours were within 5 years of my age, and there wasn't a moment I didn't have a friend to hang out with. We were even lucky enough to have a park within a couple of blocks of our neighbourhood, and given the safe nature of our area, we were all allowed to walk and spend time at the park alone. This thread made me remember the time my best friend and I were successful in fleeing an attempted kidnapping. We were around 10 years old and made our way up to the park as usual. This time though, we got a bad vibe and heard a man screaming hello at us. We were both as tiny as could be and luckily fit under this 12-inch part of the playground where no one could see us. When within seconds of successfully making it under and hiding, the man that had yelled suddenly appeared. We could see him, but he couldn't see us. Then he said, "I heard 2 girls playing. Where are you guys? Come on out." He looked through the tubes, slides, and rest of the playground set. We lucked out, and he didn't find us. We had never been so silent in our lives. After a few minutes, he'd gone, so we made a run for it. We walked back along the roads from the playground, and were aware of shortcuts through other people's yards. So we took a dash through our neighbours' yards, and as soon as we hit a road again, a car pulled up alongside us. It was him. He asked us to get in his car and that he would take us home as we were so young. We declined. We carried on walking, and he slowly followed us with his window down, begging us to get in and let him drive us. We eventually walked up to a random person's house, pretending it was one of ours. We understand now this wasn't the wisest idea, but we were 10, and all we knew was that we needed to get away from him. After pretending this house was ours and going to the front door, he left us alone. Then we made a dash to my actual house. We never told our parents, and we should have. We are now both 22, and to this day we both bring it up every now and again, and discuss how poorly this could have gone, and how we could have met a horrible fate. This was 1992, when my mother was going through a bad patch in her marriage and was getting chemotherapy for breast cancer. We lived in a very quiet town, where residential areas only had small markets. For everything else, including pharmacy and public calls, we had to go to the main market, which was almost 3.5 miles from our house, 1.5 miles from our apartment blocks to the main road, and then 2 miles to the market, either by foot or by public transport. So my mother, who was going through a tough time, given my father's complete disconnection with us, used to call her brother, my uncle, for advice and catharsis, who lived in another city. For those calls she had to go to the public call office, PCO, which was run by 2 weird men, and the same market had the pharmacy where my mother would buy her medications. I was 11, and my older sister was 17 at the time. And one evening my mother, along with my sister, went to the PCO to talk to my uncle. I don't remember why, but I think my father asked her to leave the house, and she wanted to discuss her options. She was in distress and didn't realize it was already late when she'd finished the call, so the market was closed, and so was the public transport. My mum and sis paid the bill and started their walk home on the path next to the main road. Then the two PCO owners closed the PCO and started following them, one on foot right behind them, trying to offer a ride, and the other on bicycle next to them on the deserted main road. My mother strictly refused, held my sister's hand tightly, and started walking as fast as she could, when a white van appeared on the service road and started driving slowly next to them. The PCO guys had already arranged a ride with some really bad intentions and didn't seem to go away. They were probably waiting for them to get off the main road to strike. When on the next turn, two men came from the opposite side of the footpath, and to my mother's relief, it was the pharmacist and his friend, who were returning to pick his car from his shop's parking after a walk. They saw the men and the van and immediately realized what was going on. They stopped, said hello, and asked if she needed help. They agreed to walk them home, and the PCO men fled upon seeing the guys. The kind pharmacist saw my mother and sister to the safety of our house, and my mother never went to that PCO again. So I'm currently a 17-year-old male, living in what I guess you would call the suburbs in Leeds, England. This happened in 2019, when I was given the pleasure of taking my younger brother, who was 8 at the time, and his friend, who I'll name Charlie, out trick-or-treating. It was a Thursday, so I went to school, then picked my brother up from his school with his friend, and a few hours later we set off. For the most part, the night went smoothly. My brother seemed to be having fun, and the both of them seemed to have got substantially more things than I expected. Once we'd passed our house, I needed the bathroom, so I went in quickly, leaving the kids on the driveway. In retrospect, that wasn't the best idea, but we lived in a pretty safe neighborhood, so I thought it would be fine. Wrong. I came out to only one head. It took a while for me to realize that my brother was missing. I went to Charlie, who was eating his sweets already, frantically asking him where my brother was. He said, whilst still grabbing more sweets, that a guy came around, asking for his help. Panicking now, I went the direction Charlie pointed to, and Charlie slowly followed suit after I assumed he'd started to realize what was happening. There I saw a man escorting him down the street, into some rusty old Skoda or something, I can't remember. I shouted his name, and the man turned almost inhumanely, like the way a deer might after hearing something. This man was in his late 40s, almost impossibly pale, overweight and balding. He looked like the kind of guy you'd see working the counter at a newsagent's or something. Not the kind of guy you want to see taking your brother away whatsoever. He took a step back and started to make some BS excuse about how my brother was begging him to take him away. Of course I didn't buy it, and he seemed to notice. He shoved my brother back to me, and I grabbed him back as the guy quickly drove away. Before getting into the house, I made my brother and Charlie swear up and down that they wouldn't tell mine or his parents. As much as this might not have been the best decision, like I said, we live in a really safe place. Things like this were so rare and unbelievable that any adult would think we were probably lying anyway. They did so, and when my parents got back from running some errands, I said everything was fine and that the kids had fun. As much as I would like to say something else happened, nothing did. I never saw the guy or the car ever again, nor did anything come on the news about kidnappings that night. But take this as a reminder that nobody anywhere is safe, and that you should never do what I did and leave young children unattended. When I was 16 years old, I would sometimes pitch a tent with a friend or two, deep in the woods or in some field tucked away in a corner. We would just get drunk, and would usually do it on a Friday or Saturday, then go home the following morning. One weekend we did just that, and the following morning I took down the tent and began to head home. This would have been about 5 a.m. or so, as it was early when we got up. As I made my way down through the woods onto the main road, it was still dark with the sun giving the slightest hint of a flicker on the horizon. I said goodbye to my friend and made for home. And as I was on my way, an older man, possibly in his 50s, asked me where I'd just come from, obviously noticing the rolled-up tent tucked under my arm. I told him that I had been camping with a friend and was heading home. He didn't strike me as being weird or anything, and he looked fairly normal. At that time, I didn't really make anything of him, as you sometimes see dog walkers at that time, even though he had no dog with him. He then asked if I had eaten anything, and when I replied I hadn't, he immediately offered to give me breakfast if I liked. It did register as slightly weird, but I wasn't really thinking all that much. I was just wanting to get home. What did arouse my curiosity, however, and put me on edge a bit, was when he passed a comment about my appearance and remarked that I should really eat something. He then insisted quite vehemently that he doesn't mind, and I was beginning to feel a bit nervous and said no thank you. He didn't seem to be annoyed with my refusal to his offer, but he was persistent about it. What really had me taking to my heels, though, was when he tried to reassure me that he has a wife, and she wouldn't mind either. It was at that point I told the man I had to get going, and I just took off, refusing to look behind me. It's strange, because I had been up and around that area so many times that I knew it like the back of my hand. I continued to frequent that area, but I never did see that man again. Not that I would have even recognized him to begin with. I've been hesitant to share this creepy encounter for quite some time, mainly because I'm sure I'll get some tongue lashings due to my own stupidity throughout the whole situation. But I've definitely learned my lesson from it, and I've decided to finally share it in hopes that it prevents it from happening to anyone else. It happened 2 to 3 years ago, whilst I was living in Wilmington, North Carolina. I was around 22 or 23 years old at the time, and I'd spent my night at the local beach bars with my roommate. She drove us to the beach, and we planned to take an Uber home, and all I brought out with me was my phone, ID, and maybe $20 in cash. So me and my roomie had been hanging at the beach bars, having a few drinks, dancing, and chatting with the locals. It was a fun night. We stayed out until the bars were closed, so it was around 3 a.m. when we finally got kicked out to call an Uber. The sidewalks were crowded with plenty of other drunk college students that were also waiting for their rides or running next door to grab a slice at the pizzeria before heading home. At this point, we were just casually chatting with this guy that was standing next to us, when another very inebriated guy came up to him, mouthing off for seemingly no reason, other than he was looking for a fight. The guy we were talking with wasn't giving him the time of day, so the drunk guy decided to just pop him straight in the face. Of course, this warranted a reaction, so he responded by headbutting him, and drunk guy's mouth started pouring out blood immediately. Drunk guy hadn't had enough yet, and decided to spit blood on this poor guy. Then a full-on brawl proceeded to break out, and my roomie and I jumped out of the way. This was when I noticed she had some blood splattered on her face from the spit, so I told her to convince one of the bouncers to let her back into the bar to use their restroom and wash her face off, while I waited for our Uber, as they don't wait around for long if no one is there for pickup. So she went to wash her face and I was still waiting, and waiting, and waiting. until I realized that I was one of the only people left on the sidewalk. I pulled my phone out to check the time and called my roomie, only to find out it was dead. Annoyed, I started looking for her, but the bar she'd gone into to wash herself was already closed. I checked the pizzeria next door, and no sign of her. So I then decided to walk back to her car, thinking she might have gone back to grab something before the Uber came, but no such luck. At this point I was panicking. I had absolutely no clue where she'd gone, my phone was dead, and I'd got no debit card to have someone else call me an Uber. So I decided I had no choice but to walk home, and got to it. I was only about 15 minutes into my walk before this man pulled over and offered to give me a ride. I kindly said no thank you, as I had no idea if they'd been drinking or if they had any bad intentions. I also had no way to call for help if something bad were to happen. So they pulled back onto the road and drove away. Then another man pulled over to offer a ride or call an Uber for me. I explained that I didn't have a debit card to pay for the Uber, so he insisted I let him give me a ride. He said I could sit in the back, so I didn't even have to talk to him, and he promised he wouldn't do anything creepy. But looking back now, I should have taken this nice man up on his offer. I didn't get any bad vibes from him, but I just couldn't bring myself to get into a stranger's car. So I finally convinced him that I'd be fine, as I'd feel safer walking, so he pulled back off and wished me well. About 20 minutes later into my walk, I started to approach an intersection. I'd been walking down a dark sidewalk with no streetlights for most of my journey, so when I began to approach the well-lit intersection, I decided to cut through the parking lot of a bank in an attempt to stay out of sight and not draw any attention to myself. Well, this didn't end up working out in my favour, because as I'd cut into the lot, a man driving by must have seen me and decided to pull into the parking lot. I found this odd, so I started to head back to the sidewalk to avoid another unwanted offering of a ride home. The man rolled down his window and yelled out to me before I could make it out of the parking lot. He said, "Hey, I'm an undercover cop. Step over here to my vehicle now." This man was driving a gold SUV, looked to be around 30 to 35, with a buzz cut, and all I could see of his clothing was a black collared shirt. For whatever reason, I panicked and didn't want to get into trouble, so I approached his vehicle, and he then started questioning me right away. "What are you doing out at this time of night? Why are you walking down the street by yourself? How much have you had to drink?" I was so upset already about the whole situation, I started crying and trying to explain myself to him. I told him that I'd lost my roommate, my phone was dead, I had no money to get myself a ride, and I didn't want to hitch a ride with a stranger. After hearing all this, he started to get aggravated with me. He told me to stop crying and asked if I was on drugs or if I had any drugs on me. "Of course not," I said. "All I've got on me is a dead phone and my ID." He asked to see my ID, handed it back to me, and said he needed to search my bag for drugs, asking if he could step out of the car to pat me down. This is when my red flags finally went off, and I came to the realization that this might not be an undercover cop after all. I asked to see his police badge, and objected to any searches or pat-downs until he presented it. He'd already had his door open at this point, and had one foot on the ground, and became irritated with me when I asked to see his badge, but remained halfway out of his car. I asked, "How do I even know you're a cop? You're in an unmarked car with no uniform on." After I said that, he got back into his car, shut his door, and told me to have a good night. Before he could even drive off, I started running back to the sidewalk as quickly as possible, as my worst fear had just been confirmed. Right then I realized how close I had actually come to being abducted, or whatever other sick crap he had in mind. I started crying and hyperventilating when he finally drove off out of sight, and I took off my sandals to continue running the entire way home. I got back to my place around 5 a.m. with blisters on my feet and found my roomie sleeping peacefully in her bed. I asked her the next morning what the hell happened and explained the entire situation that had unfolded after we'd gotten separated. She said she looked all over for me and waited as long as she could, but finally just left in the Uber and assumed I'd met a guy and gone back to his place for the night. I've never gone back to anyone's place, so needless to say, I was pissed, and I never went out drinking with her ever again. I still have no idea how we weren't able to find each other, since I stayed on that sidewalk until it was empty. I'm just thankful that man decided to cut his losses and leave me there that night. That was definitely the creepiest and scariest encounter of my life. If you ever decide to go out for drinks, go with people you can trust. Make sure your phone is charged, and don't stop to talk to any weird men posing as undercover cops. A long time ago, when I was 6 years old, I'm in my early 40s now, I was kidnapped whilst walking with my mother and brothers on Bourbon Street in New Orleans, Louisiana. I have only splintered images as memories of this day, but the way my mother and my granny tell the story goes like this. I have 2 older brothers. We were all about a year apart. All 4 of us were walking along Bourbon Street, where there is an area with a large fountain. I played in this fountain with all the other kids often, because it was Louisiana in the summer and hot as hell. Now, I'm not going to lie, I was adorable as a kid. I'm the only redhead in my family, and when I was young, my hair was fire red. Not stupid orange, but that colour red that women all over the world spend billions on every year trying to get dyed in their hair. I had freckles, and I had an adorable stutter. Anyway, we were walking along, and my older brother Jason was in Mum's arms, as he'd stubbed his toe and was upset. I was clinging onto one hand, and my brother Josh, who was 2 years older than me, was walking directly in front of her. Then suddenly, these are my mum's words, a tall Creole voodoo-type man with long hair walked up beside me, grabbed me and sprinted away. She started yelling, "That man took my baby! That man took my baby!" and was unsure if she should drop my brothers, leaving them vulnerable and exposed to pursue. Lucky for my ginger ass, there was a police officer on a horse within earshot that came trotting up, and my mum yelled at the cop, "That man took my baby," and pointed him out just as he rounded a corner out of sight. The cop took off after the suspect, and about 2 blocks later, the cop had caught up with me in the arms of this guy, who dropped me realizing he was screwed, and tried to get away in a car that was waiting for him. A car chase ensued with them and the cops, and depending on who tells the story, Mum or Granny. After the chase ended, the suspects fired at police, and the cops ended up killing them. Or they didn't, I'm still unsure. But I was rescued and brought back to my mum unscathed, albeit freaked out. There is no telling what would have happened to me had that cop not been there on his horse. I may have been sacrificed, voodoo is a thing, or sold on the sex market, or who knows what. I live in a very big city that has 5 boroughs. You probably know it. I'm a few minutes away from Manhattan, so there's a lot of traffic, and it's not uncommon to see license plates from neighbouring states. There's a major boulevard nearby, and few slightly major roads with a lot of retail, and then a bunch of side streets. Now these side streets are usually very empty, so it can go one of 2 ways. A Mercedes-Benz from the Mercedes dealership down the street will go 60 up a side street and nearly crash into a bus on a road. Then an out-of-state plate will go 15 miles an hour. Usually I'm used to seeing both. but on one day in particular in 2016, whilst riding my bike, I saw a black 2015 Honda Civic that looked very, well, off. My dad was up the street sitting on the corner, keeping an eye on me as I rode around the block. He isn't from the city, but from a small town in a neighbouring state about 50 miles northwest, so he usually keeps a pocket knife or a big-ass 16-inch knife in his pocket. So as I was riding on the opposite side of the block where my dad was standing, I saw the black Civic speed up. Then it began to slow down and match my speed. I noticed this because when I sped up, he sped up, and as I slowed down, he slowed down. My dad texted me to meet him at our apartment, which was across the street from this block. So I stopped at a pedestrian light and waited. Then suddenly the guy hopped out of his car and asked if I was going to my house. I said yes. Then he said, "Oh, I'm friends with your dad. He told me to pick you up." I told him that he'd got the wrong guy. Then he said, "No, it's definitely you. Get in." "No," I said. I didn't feel safe at all. At this point he started getting angry and walking closer to me and said, "If you keep being a little asshole, then your dad's going to be mad. I'll just have to force you into the car." The light then turned green, and I knew my dad was at home. So I sped off and texted my dad as I was riding along, telling him I was being chased by a black Honda Civic with jersey plates. I was even able to text the plate number to him and told him to call 911. I pulled into the apartment and the dude hopped out to pursue me further. He ran around the corner, and that's when my dad confronted him. He pulled out his knife on him and scared him off, and I think the guy was eventually caught, thankfully. I'm now 15, and this still scares me. I still ride around on that street though. My mum's from the city and reassures me it was a one-off thing. I go out a lot with friends on my own now, and I've never had any other encounters. But this is a good example for the young ones in areas that might not be the best. If you see a black Honda Civic with New Jersey plates and a plate holder that says Patterson Auto Mall, run. Nine years ago, I was in a terrible relationship that was abusive, and he was on meth all day, every day. We hadn't long had a fight as per usual, so I ran for safety and retreated to spend time alone, as I had nowhere else to go. I left to go to a park which was more like an oval, and the usual types of people were around, like a couple of kids and their parents playing on the oval, a man giving his husky a drink next to me at the tap. I was sitting on the bench against a toilet block, and a couple of women who were running. Then just then, the atmosphere totally changed. I had my head down when I heard a car pull up off the road, and as I looked up, the oval had gone quiet. Only myself and the man with his dog and this person in a ute. Everyone else had literally vanished. The person in the ute opened his door and the back door, which I hadn't noticed until later, and was talking to the man with the dog. I felt safe as long as that man and dog was there, but then he said bye, and he left. The man in the ute started chatting away casually to me, and was asking questions along the lines of, "What's your name? I'm Ted. Where are you going?" I had my work uniform on. And he also asked if I had a boyfriend. Then he said, "You're coming to the clubhouse to dance," along with other things like that. So I stood up, said goodbye, and started to walk away as my gut said, run. So I did, as fast as I could. I then turned back to see the man quickly shutting the car doors, and that's when I noticed a second person. He started the car up and drove around the block to the other side, which was in the direction I had run. I hid behind people's bushes and shrubs in a cul-de-sac, then saw them looking out of their windows for me. They did a few laps, and in between them I knocked on about 5 doors before a lovely old couple let me in and called the police. I stayed there for an hour, too terrified to leave, and was shaking with fear. Eventually I left as the police were taking a long time, and I made it home, where I crouched between the screen and doorway until the asshole abuser got home. Once he had, I went to a friend's place, while the cops searched for the guy and his car. I'd given a statement, and the police made a report, but nothing came of it. The police were actually more concerned re my living circumstances. Fast forward to that same weekend, and I was out having a few drinks with my friend, when I spotted Ted, 2 poker machines away from me. Thankfully he never recognized me, and I just froze and left. His friends were calling him by another name too, not Ted. 9 years on and it still plays on my mind, like an unforgettable creepy crazy movie. Just trust your intuition, 100%. This happened just a few hours ago. I was taking my dog on his last walk for the night, and right before I walked out the door, I realized I didn't have my phone. I figured it'd be a quick walk, so whatever, no need to turn back and get it. I live in an apartment complex, and usually for the last walk, we'll just go around the parking lot. But this time, about halfway around, I saw a car coming up. It was late, and this was a suburban area, so we don't see a lot of through traffic around this time of night. And what made it significantly creepier was that this person, at midnight, was driving with a cap and sunglasses on. I remember my immediate thought being, that guy's up to no good, but I didn't think much beyond it, so I just kept walking my normal pace. Then about 10 feet from me, the car stopped and didn't pull into a driveway or even really pull over much in the road. It was just enough to be mostly out of the way on this rounded corner, and there was no one else around. The door opened, and my heart nearly leapt out of my chest. Now my building had 3 entrances, 2 metal doors that require keys, and the main entrance which has 2 sets of double glass doors and requires 2 fob readers after a certain hour. The closest was a metal door, and I also didn't want to risk this person seeing which way I went once I'd entered the building. I booked it with my dog, unlocked that door faster than I thought was possible, and hyperventilated all the way up to my floor. The first thing I did when I got upstairs was get my husband and explain what happened. We checked outside our window, which looks out to the front of the building, and the car was gone. He doesn't usually worry about things, and his job has exposed him to similar situations, so when he seemed genuinely concerned about the encounter, I only ended up feeling more terrified. Then, of course, I got a quick lecture about why I always need to have my phone on me. I assured him that I wouldn't be leaving it behind again, but it'll be a while before I go on a walk this late alone again. Hey, thanks for listening. I hope you enjoyed my video, and if you did, could you please give me virtual hugs by subscribing and clicking that notifications button. I also have a Patreon page and YouTube channel membership if you'd like to support me further. Thank you again for being here. Keep being creepy.